Hey everybody, how is it going? Forgive the terrible hair, I've run out of hair gel, but also please forgive the fact I haven't actually uploaded anything for an entire 8 days. I said before in the last video that we've been pretty busy recently. Last week was probably the busiest week we've had for a very long time. This week's going to be a little bit more of the same, but hopefully once all of that's out of the way, we'll settle down. In this video, I'm going to talk you through a month of my training. I feel like a month is a better period of time rather than a week because anyone can train a lot for a week. I've chosen the month of January because in January I'm still working full time alongside my training, and I think that's probably more applicable to those of you watching this at home as well. Also, it was a really hard month. It was a very pivotal month because it would have been 2.5, 3 months before I was about to return to competition. Obviously that's not happened this year because of the coronavirus. Here goes. I think it's quite important to add a little bit of context before we get going. So for the entire Christmas week, so the week of the 23rd to the 29th of December, I only did 6 hours of training. One of those was a run. There were a couple of easy bike rides and a little bit of walking, but on the whole, it was a complete week off where I really made the most of Christmas, basically, enjoyed time with my family and had a bit of a break. Then we went straight back to work. So on the 30th of December, I went out and I did 4 hours early in the morning. I had to be back relatively well on time because my wife was going to work at 9. So that 4 hours was done before 9 o'clock in the morning. That was a standard endurance ride. Although looking at it here, I also did a few little sort of threshold style surges. So it's 4 times 10 minutes, 2 minutes higher, 2 minutes easier. Just sort of tickling the system, nothing too strenuous at that point. The next day was a 5-hour ride, and there were some 30-second efforts of 500 watts, followed by 30 seconds in zone 1. And they again lasted for 6 minutes, 3 blocks of 6 minutes. On the Wednesday then, on January the 1st this year, just did an hour and 35 minutes, nice and gentle. So in this first week of January, I completed a total of 24.5 hours of training, which gives me a TSS of 1128. My first day back at work was a Thursday. Now the work hours at GCN were 9 o'clock in the morning till 5:30 in the evening, and they were pretty strict. They were in the office in Bath. But if you're going to ride to work, you also had to add a little bit of time to walk to the shower. So the showers at GCN, they were never repaired after the flooding, which meant we had to walk 4 minutes to a hotel to get a shower and then 4 minutes back. So whilst it's not that important in the context of my training, it did mean that I was having to leave at around 7:15 every single morning just to make sure I got into work on time. Hour and 26 minutes into work, and on that ride I did 3 times 10 minutes at like a low level zone 3, so that's 280 watts. You'll notice throughout the period of January the watts sort of crept up a little bit, and that's because as I was getting fitter, getting back into training, sort of reopening all of those pathways that were used to being activated before I retired, I was quite quickly able to accelerate my way through, and it actually went really, really well. It was a very well thought out month. On the way home in the evening, I did some funky efforts, as I like to call them. So these were like sprints into maintained intensity and then into a really high cadence burst for 90 seconds. So it's 30 seconds of mixed intensity effort, and there were 10 of these intervals. This is a really good one. It gets you really breathing hard. And I think on the whole, I probably preferred doing it in the morning. But in the evening, it worked equally well. It helped break at the time, and doing loads of different intervals, even though these were quite short, it helped the time go really, really fast. So when you're not getting home until, well, this ride started at 5:50 p.m, so that's quite a late start to a ride. Meaning if it's taking you an hour and 25, you're not getting home until, well, kids' bedtime, unfortunately. That was the Thursday. On Friday then, we had a nice little rest. Rest is probably the most important thing, especially when you're working long hours as well. You really need to give yourself a time to have a break. Ideally, these rest days would have come at the weekend, I think, if I look back now, just so that I could have had more time with the children. But that would have meant that I would have missed out on the training time, and at the time it's really hard to work out what was more important. Such was the quandary that my mind was in. Saturday and Sunday then, 2 endurance rides, 4 hours ride on the Saturday and a 5 hours ride on the Sunday. The Saturday ride again had some over threshold efforts, so 3 times 6 minutes with the 500 watt efforts. On the Sunday we then did 4 times 12 minutes at 320 watts. Then the Sunday, as I said, was 5 hours, and this included 4 12-minute intervals at 320 watts, which at the time would have been like the upper end of zone 3, creeping in towards zone 4. And I quite enjoyed them because they weren't really stretching me. They were manageable, and that gave me a nice confidence boost. Even though I've definitely done higher numbers in the past, it was just nice to know that even on a high volume training week, I was able to achieve the numbers that I was setting out to achieve. So that was week number 1. My blue line, the CTL on Training Peaks, would have gone from 73 up to 84. So not a huge climb, but at the time it was enough. You know, that's probably the highest it had been for since May 2018 or June, July 2018. So that was nice. Straight back into the second week then, and it's again another week of high volume. So it was 24 hours in the first week, or 24.5, and then 20 hours in the second week. Faster ride into work, hour and 7. For some reason, must have had a tailwind because that looks a little bit shorter. In fact, the ride is shorter. Can't explain that one. Maybe I didn't get any GPS signal to start with. That was fasted. That was something I did a little bit at the start of the year as well. Something I'd never really wanted to play around with too much before when I was racing, but this time I found with the reduced training time, you know, the increased work hours and things like that, it was actually really beneficial. Commute back home in the evening, that was a little bit longer. That was an hour and 50, 48 kilometers, so I've gone a little bit longer on the way around, and include some surges over the top of the hills just to sort of get the heart and the lungs pounding away again, but also get your body used to recovering from the intensity whilst you're still pedaling over the other side. Tuesday was the introduction of some of the stretching work that I started doing, so it's only a 15-minute evening stretch. Otherwise it was a rest day. Didn't ride my bike on that day. On the Wednesday then, it was a repeat of the week before, so back to the breathing to help increase heart and lung capacity. And then what was quite a common occurrence was actually that one ride would have intervals in the morning or in the evening, and then the other ride would just be a standard pedal, so not too strenuous. That was something that really changed this time with my training. In the past, I felt like I was always pushing, always chasing, whereas this time around with Stefan Mastella of Spokes, I actually felt that I was either training really hard, doing short, hard intervals well above threshold, or I was spending a lot of time cruising, which meant that I could actually train more, so the volume was higher, but the overall fatigue and certainly the mental side of the fatigue wasn't the same. Bearing in mind, a lot of this time throughout this period, I was using my training as some form of escapism. I was just trying to get away from being quite miserable for whatever reason at work. On the Thursday, again, we got a 2-hour fasted morning ride, so that would have been leaving in the dark. And I always quite like that. I quite enjoy an early start to a training ride. You feel like you've got one over the world when you're out before everyone else is moving around. Certainly in the Cotswolds, where the roads are mega quiet, you don't see anyone, and that was always quite enjoyable. Then on the way home, we had 2 20-minute high or mid to high zone 3 at the time, it would have been tempo efforts. And again, that's just enough to get that sort of connectivity field, so that constant pressure on the pedals. And I always felt throughout my entire career that actually just maintaining that pressure on the pedals felt really good. There she is, the director.
Go away.
Friday's then a second day off, so reduced hours on this week compared to the first week with the 2 days off. But on the weekend, we're straight back up to just over 3 hours and up towards the 5 hours. And the intervals on the weekend were very, very similar to the intervals in the week before. Same power, same sort of targets, although I'm guessing the weather may have been a little bit worse, otherwise I wouldn't cut the rides that slightly bit shorter. So going into the third week of January, I would have definitely been starting to feel a little bit more tired than I'd used to been feeling. But at the same time, I would have been feeling fitter as well. Like I can see that my weight's coming down, my sleep hours are fairly stable here. Foundation work, stretching again on the Monday, so that's the hamstring stretches and the lower back strengthening efforts. They were really good. It's quite an intense session. I'll put a link to the YouTube video that I was using for that, because it is something that you might want to try at home. Easy day on the Tuesday, and then we've got a double commute day. It was always a bit of a challenge in my head to try and complete a full week of commuting, but ultimately I think I would have been on my knees, to be really honest. Riding an hour and a half before and after work every single day, 40 kilometres each way, which is exactly what it was door to door, I think would have worn me down quite quickly, especially then on top of everything we were doing at GCN. Into the Wednesday then, we've got those breathing efforts again. I really enjoyed those. As I said before, they helped the time go really quickly. It was also quite cool to try and work out exactly where on the ride each effort was going to be, and then try and squeeze it in so that I wasn't doing it as I was approaching a junction or anything like that. I quite like that sort of time calculation challenge whilst on a bike ride. On the Thursday then, got some different efforts with the 5-minute efforts. Again, these weren't max efforts, and some of these were done fasted as well. Let me find the exact details here for you. So these are 5 times 5 minutes at effectively zone 3. So it was 300 watts at the time, high cadence to get the legs really spinning nice and quickly. It's the sort of thing you could do quite easily if you live near a track, I think. And then on the way home, just standard endurance pace. So in the dark, that would have been just not paying too much attention, but making sure my legs kept on turning, not getting too hard up the climbs. On the whole, I never carried a backpack. I'd leave my stuff at work, leave it in a locker, just because riding with a backpack 40 kilometers each way is not a lot of fun. I did do that to start with a laptop in the back and things, but the novelty of that wore off really quickly. Into the weekend then, and that's where we started the sprint work. After doing a big block of endurance work or doing a block of no sprint work at all, it takes a little while to sort of open up those this neuromuscular pathways, and it can be really hard to hit the high sprint numbers when you haven't trained them for a little while. It's going to come back, it's going to take a couple of weeks, but on that first ride, for example, what was my max sprint power? I'm guessing it's not going to have been too high. Not too bad, 5 seconds at 1482 watts. So not as bad as it could have been in the past. That kind of implies that, to me at least, this is done the day after a rest day, but that does imply to me that I was coping with the training volume at the time quite well. And then on the Sunday, first longer ride, and this is where the first increase in the power came. So instead of the intervals being at 320 watts, they're now at 340 watts, but again, 4 times 12 minutes, aiming to finish on a climb. So we're into the penultimate week of January now, and the first day of actual on the bike filming happened, and that was done at Castlecombe, which meant I could ride out to the filming location film there and then ride home, and I managed to squeeze 106 kilometers, so 22nd of January before I actually managed to ride my bike for work last year, or this year. Commute again on the Tuesday. Monday was a rest day, but with those exercises. The Thursday was another commuting day, but this time on the way home, 4 times 8 minutes at 360 watts. And that would have really started to bite, I think, but by the end of that ride. Should we have a little look at the comments, see what I've said? Sometimes my comments can be quite hilarious. Felt awful for the entire first half. Started the efforts and just felt better and better for the rest of the ride. Ate too much today, felt full on the bike and bloated, but happy with how it went once I got into the session. I love leaving a little diary like that because, you know, on the whole, I could remember in the past every single training ride I've ever done, just by a few keywords, but then going back and looking into the actual wording that I've used can sometimes be quite humorous. Right, this is the first time, so we've gotten to the 25th of January now, and I decide that, not necessarily that I'm going to ignore what my coach has set me, but I went for a ride with Jante Barker, who was my longest standing teammate, and I did the group ride with his Onyx Road team, and my goodness me, like, it was insane. Genuinely the hardest group ride in the UK, I reckon. We did an hour and 51 minutes at 318 watts average, normalised 352 watts. But the average speed in January was 42.6 kilometres an hour, which is what, 26 and a bit miles an hour, 26 and a half miles an hour, which I think at that time of the year is properly going for it. The average temperature was 4 degrees, setting off in the dark with lights and stuff, and that's around the sort of the south and the west of London. That was savage. And I came home and I did an hour on the turbo trainer after that because it was meant to have been a 4-hour endurance ride. Then the next day, 5 hours, 164 kilometres, 255 TSS. I'm guessing I probably didn't do the intervals I was set for that ride, although I'm going to have a little look. Yeah, so I didn't do the intervals that I was set on that ride. Instead, I did the sprint session that I should have done the day before. So I sort of mixed the 2 days up a little bit, but got a very different training effect. And actually, after that weekend, Stefan did send me a message asking, how far away do you live from Jante? Could you do this more often? And I wish I had, but unfortunately, you know, it's a 2-hour drive for a training ride is quite a lot to ask, especially when you're working all week. Right, we're into the final week now. Rest means rest. On this final training week, which does go into the 1st and the 2nd of February, only did 7 hours of training, and that's a proper recovery week. That is. I think that's the most important thing is when you're training hard, you stick to it, and you follow it to the T. But when you're recovering, it's even more important to really take your foot off the pedals, as it were, off the gas, and really make sure you focus on eating healthily, drinking properly, because if you don't recover properly, you're never ever going to make the adaptations that you're training to reach. So total training hours for the entire month of January is in and around the 73.5 hours. I'm saying that just because I've got at the start the last 2 days of December, and then that final week also includes the first days of February, though these aren't actually included in the total for January, either of those. 3,519 TSS, 52,000 kilojoules, and then the peak numbers for the month, I mean, they're kind of by the by because there weren't that many max efforts. In fact, there weren't any max efforts at all, and that's quite different to how I would have trained in the past as well. Was a month of training like this sustainable whilst having 2 kids, my wife and a full-time job? Absolutely no way. I mean, if I'd had to train all year like that, for me personally, I couldn't have maintained that. Something had to give at some point. However, I did it thinking it was going to be a one-off month. In February, things were going to change. Into March, into April, we'll be racing and it'd all work out. And, you know, I'd go back to the level of fitness that I was accustomed to having had 2 years previously. As it is, we all know the world changed slightly, and there has been no racing this year. And in fact, ever since the start of June, I've actually found it increasingly hard to train, purely because the chance of returning to racing this year is looking less and less likely. Certainly there isn't any national level racing. If you watch any of my other videos, you'll see that I've already addressed that. And since we are talking about things being sustainable, about how everything looks, if we dive into my performance management chart up there on Training Peaks, you'll see that my fitness went from 76 and fatigue at 108 right up to 157 for the fatigue and 104 for the fitness. So that's the blue and the purple lines if you look at that graph. That's quite a big gain for someone that's actually trying to do other things with their life at the same time. I was motivated, although you'll notice there is a little bit of a dip afterwards, and I'm sure at some point in the future I'll address exactly why that was and give you a great load of detail. I mean, there's a reason that on social media I use the mental health hashtags and things like that, and I think that could be a really interesting video on its own. To give you a little bit more context, in December I was doing a little bit more running as extra training because I hadn't yet decided or committed to commuting to work either way, and also I was still going on trips. However, in January I decided the best way to get to work was to commute, and that meant I could also do the training. It actually saved time in a way, because otherwise I had to ride the turbo trainer in the morning and again in the evening. I thought that maybe I could get out at lunchtime, But if you've only got an hour for lunch, it's actually quite hard to make a session count. You know, I was trying to return to the level of fitness that I'd been at before, which is a little bit different to had I just wanted to go and do my local races. I think if I'd wanted to adapt my training to racing locally, I didn't need the same amount of volume. You know, some of the races that I was intending to do this year were a genuine 4 or 5 hours long, and also there would have been stage racing as well. Had I wanted to do the regional level racing or just the mountain biking, I probably could have gotten away with doing quite a lot less training, which in hindsight might have been quite a good idea, but we live and learn. So to summarise, there's a huge amount of endurance work. I'd say well over 80% of the actual rides were purely endurance focused. There's a tiny bit of sprint work in there, a few sessions. There's a lot of work focusing on the cardiovascular system, my heart and lungs. And there was a lot of work focusing on my threshold as well. And as that month went on, I definitely felt that I was getting better. I remember getting to the end of the month and really feeling as strong as I've ever felt on a bike. Certainly that ride with Janssen cemented that fact. I felt like I was able to do the sort of turns on the front of the bunch, on the front of the group that we rode with, that easily matched anything I'd ever done before. And I just felt really, really good on my bike. So whilst I do look back and think, blimey, that was a tough month, I'm not sure if I could go through that again. At the time, it did really pay dividends because I was feeling really, really good. If you do have any questions about any of my training that I've done in January this year, in this detailed month, or at any other point, drop them in the comments below and I'll answer them in a question and answer at another point. Otherwise, thank you for watching. I'll see you again soon.